On the 2nd of March 1956, in the women's ward of St Andrew's Mental Hospital in Northampton, a 79-year-old patient who had been in the ward for 29 long monotonous years and bedridden for the past 5 was finally preparing for a long-awaited death. She may have spared a last thought for Dalkeith, the seaside Dublin town she and her 7 siblings grew up in, or perhaps she remembered the family's old Georgian townhouse at 12 Marion Square. She may have thought fondly of her older and shell-shocked brother Victor, found dead in an inn in Surrey, or perhaps her estranged late father. Or, just maybe, she recalled the faint sound of gunfire on a teeming Roman piazza. Perhaps she cursed her poor aim one final time. It had been 11 years since the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was killed by Italian partisans as he attempted to flee to Switzerland, shot dead and hanged next to his final mistress, Clara Petacci, outside a petrol station in Milan. If Violet had been a better shot, she would have changed the course of history. On the 7th of April 1926, armed with a revolver in one hand and a rock in the other, the Honourable Violet Albina Gibson, the second youngest child of the late 1st Baron Ashbourne, marched out of the convent of Santa Brigida, where she had been convalescing after shooting herself in the chest, and sped towards the crowds of students gathered at the Piazza del Campidoglio, bellowing the official hymn of the National Fascist Party. The grey-haired woman, now 50, watched as Il Duce stepped out from the conservatorium and waved across the piazza at his adoring fans, but he turned his head just as Violet's revolver went off. The supposed-to-be fatal shot, aimed directly at the Italian dictator's temple, only grazed the bridge of his nose. Frantically pulling the trigger a second time, the revolver jammed, and suddenly Violet was dragged down by an enraged crowd. She was kicked and battered and bruised before being finally apprehended by Italian police and shipped back to England, surprisingly without charge. Despite pleading for her own release over the course of her confinement, Violet was condemned to a second life in the Northampton mental asylum, where she died without friends or family, paranoid, empty and infirm, yearning for an end to a life she had tried desperately to cut short time and time again. This is Crown Undone. Violet Gibson was born on the 31st of August in 1876, but her childhood in Dalkeith was marred by serious and persistent bouts of scarlet fever, rubella and pleurisy. The Gibsons were one of the most distinguished legal and political families in Ireland. At one stage, Violet's father Edward was expected by some to become British Prime Minister. Edward Gibson was a key player in Britain's Conservative Party during the ascent of political figures like Benjamin Disraeli and Lord Randolph Churchill. He was appointed Ireland's Attorney General a year after Violet was born, Lord Chancellor of Ireland in 1885 and British Privy Councillor the same year. As Lord Chancellor, Edward was awarded a baronetcy, becoming the 1st Baron Ashbourne, and the title the Honourable was bestowed upon his 8 children, 4 girls and 4 boys. Violet's mother Frances was a deeply religious woman and an early convert to Christian Science, an anti-medical denomination founded in the United States in 1879 by Mary Baker Eddy, who believed that disease could not exist because the material world and the body itself was only an illusion. Given her mother's faith and the illnesses that Violet suffered as a child, her survival seems like a miracle. In fact, historian Turtle Bunbury writes that, quote, "Violet's survival is all the more remarkable given that her mother believed her daughter's ailments were a penance for an unspecified sin." As would have been common for affluent Protestant women of the time, Violet was educated by a governess at home and was predominantly taught music, art, French and Italian. She was presented as a debutante at Queen Victoria's court and began attending the season's balls at Dublin Castle, meeting the then Duke of York, later George V, when he visited Dublin in 1897. Raised by a Christian Scientist mother and a Protestant father, Violet grew up fascinated by religion before converting to Roman Catholicism, much to the chagrin of her father, who was so dismayed that he stopped talking to his daughter completely. In the wake of her father's death in 1913, Violet visited Dublin for the final time to inter his ashes in the family vault before travelling to Paris at the start of the First World War as a pacifist to advocate for peace, but continued to face major health issues like cancer that required a left mastectomy and acute appendicitis that also required surgery. By 1922, she was devastated by the news that her brother Victor, who had returned with severe shell shock from the Anglo-Boer War, had died. Mentally spiralling, Violet began wandering across busy roads in the middle of the night, and on one one occasion, when the housekeeper's daughter attempted to help, Violet pulled out a knife and cut the child's hand. She was confined to Holloway Sanatorium, and shortly into her stay reportedly attempted to kill another patient, before her family somehow managed to have her removed from the institution. Now, living on her own in Kensington, Violet became intensely interested in Italy and began telling everyone who would listen of her staunch opposition to the conservative and fascist-sympathising Pope. She sailed to Rome in November 1924 with her Irish nurse, Mary McGrath, and on arrival requested an audience with the Pope. Though the request was denied, it may have possibly been inspired by a wish to kill. 3 months after she arrived in Rome, Violet shot herself with a bullet that just missed her heart but struck her shoulder. She spent 2 months recuperating in a psychiatric clinic, and then was transported to the convent of Santa Brigida, where she pinned up newspaper cuttings about Mussolini, acquired a gun, and walked out on the morning of the 7th of April with one mission in mind. Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini was 42 the day that Violet Gibson marched out of the convent, having been ousted by the Italian Socialist Party for criticising the party and its support for non-interventionism during the First World War. Mussolini came to wholeheartedly denounce orthodox socialism, despite spending years as the editor of the party's newspaper, for what he believed to be its failure to recognise that the war had meant national identity and national loyalties had become more important than class distinction or class conflict. Instead of a Marxist revolutionary class struggle, Mussolini began to advocate for a militarised Italian nationalism that elevated a revolutionary elite of any social class, one that would ruthlessly revive the Italian nation. In the aftermath of the First World War, Mussolini's National Fascist Party, established in 1919, slowly but steadily gained ascendancy, and in 1922 Mussolini led 30,000 of the Fascist Party's paramilitary wing, the Black Shirts, into Rome, demanding the resignation of the Liberal Prime Minister Luigi Facta. When Italy's King Victor Emmanuel III denied the Prime Minister's request to declare martial law, Facta had no other choice but to resign, and power was handed over to Mussolini. Over the next decade, Mussolini dismantled practically all constitutional constraints on his power and built up an increasingly harsh police state. He was no longer responsible to a parliament. On the sunny Wednesday morning in Rome, 1926, Mussolini stepped out onto the Conservatorium's outdoor square that had been designed by Michelangelo himself. With balanced hands and a sharp gaze, the bedraggled middle-aged woman aimed her revolver and fired towards the Conservatorium, and at that exact moment, Mussolini turned his head, receiving just a graze to the bridge of his nose. As her second bullet jammed, Violet was nearly lynched by the angry crowd. Still, while Mussolini was rushed to safety, Italian police officers managed to barge through the crowd, grab hold of the attempted assassin, and transport her to prison. In just a few hours, she was identified as the Dublin-born sister of the current Baron Ashbourne. During the subsequent interrogations, Violet gave an array of confusing and contradictory answers to interrogators. At first, she completely denied responsibility, then she said the act was to impress a handsome Italian man, and then said the deed was to, quote, glorify God, who would send his angels to keep her arm steady. When asked by interrogators if she had any accomplices, she replied that she did, and then went on to name all of the saints she could think of. Diagnosed with chronic paranoia, the Italian propaganda team were quick to paint Violet as merely a religious fanatic operating alone. If anything, the assassination attempt had only consolidated Mussolini's public support. Despite surviving 4 assassination attempts over the next 14 months, Mussolini's response to Gibson seemed relatively benign. He only insisted that she be removed from Italy, and with the consent of her living siblings, Violet was taken back to England by a team headed by her sister Constance, and she was placed in the care of St Andrew's Hospital for mental diseases. Throughout her confinement, she wrote dozens of letters pleading for release, some to Winston Churchill and others to Queen Elizabeth II, all of which remained undelivered. Despondent and depressed, Violet attempted to hang herself in 1930, and she eventually died in 1956 at the age of 79, mostly unknown to the world. Still, she lived to hear of Mussolini's dramatic fall from grace, and the fate of his bloodied body, shot and left to swing upside down outside a petrol station in war-torn Milan, next to his last mistress, Clara Petacci, who had only become known to Mussolini when the then 14-year-old sent a letter of condolence to the Italian fascist dictator that had just been shot by a mad Irish woman. Although, as documentary maker Barry Dowdall asked, quote, between her and Benito Mussolini and all the things he did, who was really mad? That was the life of Violet Gibson, and this was Crown Undone.